Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, inflation doesn't look likely to roll over anytime soon. Prices are still climbing, and that trend doesn't look likely to stop, with gas and diesel prices affecting so much of the economy.
Next time you go to the grocery store, the hardware store, you buy something online, you're going to pay for it. Or I should say you're going to pay much more for it, given the fact that diesel prices now are approaching $6 a gallon for a national average.
But a growing number of analysts warn bringing inflation down could also mean bringing the economy down into a recession. A major problem for upcoming elections, the census making big mistakes in counting the populations of some states, giving some Democratic states more voters and taking voters away from some Republican states. Today marks the official celebration of Juneteenth, the holiday marking the end of slavery in 1865.
So as Black people celebrated their own emancipation in the United States, they looked to the Bible and the Old Testament as inspiration, as biblical justification and continuity between the liberation they experienced and then the liberation that was spoken of in the Bible.
We'll look at the history of Juneteenth and its biblical roots. And planting churches in a mission field right here in the United States.
The overall majority of people, I guarantee you, especially if they're from the West Coast, have never had someone sit down and explain who Jesus is.
How these missionaries are bringing the gospel to one of the most unchurched cities in America, Las Vegas. Those stories and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin with inflation hitting Americans hard in the pocketbook. The Biden administration is considering suspending the federal gas tax as one option to help Americans through this period of high inflation. More economists believe it won't be enough, as the Federal Reserve will keep raising rates to fight inflation and possibly send the economy into a recession. The Biden administration doesn't believe a recession is inevitable, but an increasing number of economists believe it's likely. Dale Hurd has the story.
With inflation now at 8.6% and food prices rising the fastest in 40 years, Americans are trying to find ways to get by, and that means less spending.
It's really kind of tough, because you want to have everything provided, but everything is so high.
I'm dipping in savings so that I can live.
Credit card debt, which dipped during the pandemic as Americans used government stimulus checks to pay down balances, has rebounded to all-time highs. As Americans tighten their belts and close their pocketbooks, it puts even more downward pressure on the economy, pushing it toward recession. Almost half of economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal say a recession is likely in the next 12 months. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen still insists a recession is not inevitable.
Clearly, inflation is unacceptably high. It's President Biden's top priority to bring it down.
But retail sales slowed last month for the first time this year, including a 4% drop in car sales. Americans have begun pulling back on spending, especially on services rather than goods. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers says all signs point to a recession.
The dominant probability would be that by the end of next year, we would be seeing a recession in the American economy.
Record fuel prices are another major inflationary pressure reverberating through the economy. While Yellen says the administration would consider suspending the federal gas tax, about 18 cents a gallon, that would not make a huge difference.
Next time you go to the grocery store, the hardware store, you buy something online, you're going to pay for it. Or I should say you're going to pay much more for it, given the fact that diesel prices now are approaching $6 a gallon for a national average.
But the biggest reason by far for inflation, according to analyst Joel Griffith, has been runaway government spending.
Look, we spent around $6 trillion extra over the past 2 years than we normally spent, and nearly every last dollar of that was printed by the Fed and used to purchase government debt. That's why we have inflation right now.
One thing economists seem to agree on: there will be no easy way out of this economic mess. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
A big change in swimming competitions. The governing body for world swimming has effectively banned transgender women from competing in women's events starting today. The members widely adopted a new policy Sunday that only permits swimmers who transitioned their genders before age 12 to compete in women's events. The new policy also proposed a new open competition category. The organization is setting up a new working group that will spend the next 6 months figuring out how to set up that category. A recent poll from the Washington Post and the University of Maryland found that 55% of Americans oppose allowing transgender women and girls to compete with other women and girls in high school sports, and 58% oppose it for college and professional sports. Now an update on the shooting at the Alabama church last Thursday night. One of the church members who wrestled the gunman to the ground is being hailed as a hero. The gunman, who had occasionally attended services at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Vestavia Hills, opened fire at a potluck dinner. Then another churchgoer in his 70s charged the gunman, hitting him with a chair and holding him down until police arrived.
It was extremely critical in saving lives. The person that subdued the suspect, in my opinion, is a hero.
The suspect is 70-year-old Robert Findley Smith. All three of the people who were shot have died. They ranged in age from 75 to 84. The Reverend Rebecca Bridges, the associate rector, led an online prayer service on the church's Facebook page Friday morning. She prayed not only for the victims and church members who witnessed the shooting, but also for the person who perpetrated the shooting. Another major problem for our election system. Mistakes in the census in 2020 have helped mainly Democratic states and hurt Republican states, and those errors could have significant consequences. They could affect who controls Congress or even wins the White House. CBN's Matt Galka brings us that story.
How many people are in your state? Well, the census tries to figure that very question out every 10 years, and the results could go a long way to determining the balance of power on Capitol Hill. But an unprecedented 2020 and a variety of factors led to a lot of undercounts and overcounts.
Trying to get an accurate number of just how many people are in the country is a tall task under normal circumstances. Millions of people, different states. The census tries to sort it all out every 10 years. An analysis of the results from the most recent census shows a miscount so large in 14 states that it affected the number of congressional seats in some of them. A census review indicates a statistically significant undercount in 6 mostly Republican-leaning states: Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Florida, Texas, and Illinois. Add to that an overcount in mostly Democrat-leaning states: Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, Utah, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Ohio. It's important since the count helps determine things like federal funding and whether a state gains or loses a House seat.
When you're talking about a very close midterm election coming up and control of the House up for grabs, these two, gains or losses could make the difference between controlling and not controlling the House for the next 2 years.
While errors are common in all census surveys, it's possible these saved Minnesota from losing a House seat and prevented Texas and Florida from gaining even more seats. Texas could have been undercounted by up to 500,000 people, and just under 200,000 would have been needed to gain a third House seat. They ended up getting 2. So what happened? It's tough to pinpoint given multiple factors, but a pandemic probably played heavily into the counts, according to Census advisor Steve Jost.
The states with higher rates of cases actually had lower quality counts, and that makes sense.
Beyond COVID, a majority of the overcounted states spent money on census outreach, and a majority of the undercounted spent little to no money urging participation. There's also a historical census issue of minority groups being undercounted every decade. The November election will determine if it will matter in Washington.
Are we going to come down to a razor slim majority in the House or the Senate for either of the parties, or is it going to be, 5 or 10 seats, which means that this would be moot?
The post-census survey won't actually change anything. The official census results will remain. States have already gone through their redistricting processes and drawn their House congressional lines, and those results will remain until the next census in 2030. Matt Galka, CBN News.
The census miscounts could affect the 2024 presidential election. Kristen Tate of the Independent Women's Voice recently wrote in The Hill that, given the nature of the mistakes, Democrats could hang on to the presidency under particularly controversial circumstances due to publicly acknowledged errors. The consequences of the Census Bureau's errors will further erode the public's trust in our electoral system. And if we thought 2000 or 2020 were contentious elections, just wait until a candidate realizes that he or she could have won the White House if the national head count were done correctly. The inability to change apportionment could spark a constitutional crisis at a time when the country cannot afford one. Coming up, today marks the official celebration of Juneteenth, marking the end of slavery in America. We'll take a look at the origins behind this holiday, how the Bible played a role, and how the church can lead by example in the future when we come back. Welcome back to NewsWatch. Today is the official federal celebration of Juneteenth, celebrating the emancipation of black people from slavery on June 19, 1865. CBN's Brody Carter spoke with historians about the holiday's biblical roots and how the church can learn from history to lead by example.
The origins of Juneteenth date back to the Civil War, where some 750,000 soldiers died, either fighting for freedom or to preserve the institution of slavery. And Juneteenth was just the beginning of progress.
Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
We learn about the civil rights movement, but it gets reduced to Rosa Parks and the I Have a Dream speech and maybe the Civil Rights Act. And that's almost the basic idea that most people have around U.S. racial history.
New York Times bestselling author and Christian thinker Dr. Jemar Tisby says some of the most important race-related events have been omitted from American history, like Juneteenth. Most history books don't even mention the name, which is why he's on a mission, re-educating the public about the day freedom finally came to all Americans.
It represents the day, June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Texas first learned of their emancipation. Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army came to Texas and he issued General Order Number 3. And in that, he said, all enslaved people in Texas are free.
At that time, Texas was the farthest state west and the last to hear of freedom, more than 2 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. As news spread, the shock for the some 250,000 enslaved Texans quickly turned to celebration.
So as black people celebrated their own emancipation in the United States, they looked to the Bible and the Old Testament as inspiration, as biblical justification and continuity between the liberation they experienced and then the liberation that was spoken of in the Bible.
Juneteenth combines the words June and 19th, but according to Tisby, it was originally referred to as Jubilee Day, a biblical reference to Leviticus 25, celebrating the Israelites' freedom from slavery in Egypt. Faith formed the foundation of what would become America's most recent federal holiday.
Because black people, even after emancipation, were often segregated and weren't allowed to gather in many public spaces, many celebrations of Juneteenth occurred at churches.
They would have fireworks. It was almost a carnival-like environment and atmosphere. There were always ministers preaching about the importance of Juneteenth and the importance of freedom.
Yet the freedom given to black Americans would become overshadowed and even replaced with the rise of race-based segregation known as the Jim Crow laws. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, professor of history at Norfolk State University, says Juneteenth commemorations went underground as the Jim Crow era ruled for nearly a century.
In that era, you have lynchings, you have the rise of race-based segregation. For many who didn't want the Confederacy to lose, it was not a cause for celebration. It was not something they wanted to highlight. And for a long time, particularly in the Jim Crow era, the field of history was dominated by white men who looked at history from a certain perspective and would not have spent much time on something like Juneteenth.
However, black Americans saw incredible progress from the Civil Rights Act in '64, the Voting Rights Act in '65, and the Fair Housing Act in '68, and yet black people were still facing an uphill battle in this nation.
Why are Black people and other people of color still experiencing discrimination and inequality after the gains of the civil rights movement?
As society, including historians, politicians, and religious leaders, seek to address the unanswered questions about race still lingering today, Dr. Tisby believes the church has an opportunity to lead and be an example in the 21st century.
I think the church could make incredible progress if we understand that racism is both individual and institutional. It's both interpersonal and systemic. We need to both change hearts and change policies. I think that's really the challenge for the church around race today.
As for Juneteenth, it's not only a day to learn about history and celebrate with food, friends, and family. It's also a day to commemorate, remember, and lament.
We have to embrace the pain, the shame, the anger, all of that collectively in order for us to be a single nation. And July 4th will have more meaning when Juneteenth becomes a part of how we tell that story about our freedoms in America.
We have every resource in the Holy Spirit to be able to do that, be able to look honestly at ourselves and our nation and say, we got it wrong. And in some ways, we're still getting it wrong. But that's okay. We don't have to be defined by our past. As a matter of fact, when we confess it and when we're truthful about it, that's when healing begins.
Dr. Tisby offers some concrete ways the church can be a guiding light in this fight for racial justice. First, by being aware of injustice. Second, by building community relationships with schools, organizations, churches, and people who are different from yourself. And thirdly, making a commitment to find solutions to problems that still plague people of color to this day, all based on the biblical mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Still ahead, the Spirit is moving in Sin City. See how these Las Vegas missionaries are growing churches during a pandemic and hear how social media is fueling their mission. Right after this. Thanks for staying with us. Las Vegas is known as Sin City, and it holds the distinction of being one of the most unchurched cities in the country. Now that's changing. A wave of church plants is taking Vegas by storm, and it's being fueled by social media. Heather Sells brings us the good news.
Las Vegas is one of the fastest growing cities in the U.S. and one of the most unchurched. It's why church planters here say this city is key to advancing the gospel.
The overall majority of people, I guarantee you, especially if they're from the West Coast, have never had someone sit down and explain who Jesus is.
Seeing themselves first as missionaries, Josh Carter and Joseph Gibbons work as Southern Baptist church planters. Their mission field, what they describe as the pre-Christian culture of Las Vegas.
These are people that did not grow up around church. It doesn't fit within their norms of how to do life.
That's why Carter, Gibbons, and their team hope to take what many know as Sin City for the gospel. They're planting 13 churches in this booming metropolis of 2 million.
Good morning, friends.
With an updated playbook that uses social media as a starting point.
It literally, that is the front door for people. They're going to check you out. They're going to follow you.
These church planters also rely heavily on meeting their neighbors face to face. For Gibbons and his wife, that has meant local Vegas playgrounds during the height of COVID.
Really, nothing was open. We have little kids, 5 and 3, and so my wife would take them out to parks and she would meet moms.
That led to relationships that then moved toward a focus on the Word.
For us, it's about not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought, but getting into a posture of we all need to meet each other on the ground level of the gospel.
And from there, Favor City Church began to grow right in the midst of a pandemic.
When the limit of gathering was 10, we were like, great, we have 6. And so we just started to gather.
Favor City is part of a wave of Southern Baptist plants that are moving the needle in the right direction. The denomination's North American Mission Board, or NAM, launched close to 600 last year, up 36% over 2019.
I think there is hope. You know, the North American Mission Board is planting hundreds upon hundreds of churches, surprisingly high numbers even in 2020.
And these churches are diverse. 6 in 10 last year were non-Anglo. That is crucial as experts predict that whites will decline to a minority population as early as 2045. Researchers say plans like Favor City could lead the way as the church in the U.S. seeks to diversify and reverse trends, especially out west and in New England, where large numbers of people have no religious affiliation. They're also battling church closures, which outpaced openings in 2019. To keep up with these closing doors and population growth, Lifeway Research estimates that nearly 2,000 new churches must open each year. That means the call for church planters is as urgent as ever, but those in the trenches caution the work is difficult and slow.
You don't necessarily magically launch a church on one day. You engage a city over a period of time. You make disciples.
Favor City recently baptized a new group of believers and began services. So while it's seen as an uphill climb in this city, Gibbons says the Spirit is moving.
I'm not building this thing. I'm just stewarding where God is active.
Reporting in Las Vegas, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Up next, a look at Father's Day and our Father in Heaven when we come back. Stay with us. Finally today, a look at Father's Day and our Father in Heaven. Matthew Barnett, the co-founder of the Los Angeles Dream Center and senior pastor of Angelus Temple, writing on CBNNews.com, "My prayer this Father's Day is for more fathers to discover the joy of fatherhood. We call God our Father, and it's no coincidence. The way He loves, protects, and provides for us is the same role He has graciously given us, the role of loving, protecting, and providing for those we love. Dads nationwide must remain steadfast as they lead their children through the perilous times we live in today." You can read his full commentary at CBNNews.com. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of CBN News Watch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News channel anytime or online with CBNNews.com. And tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com. Or you can talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Check us out on social media. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.